Okay, the next item on the agenda is a presentation, Water Quality Trends in Southwest Florida by Dr. Miles Medina from ECCO Scientific. The purpose is to brief the committee on water quality and other ecological trends in the CHNEP estuaries from 2000 to 2021, using data from the Coastal Charlotte Harbor Monitoring Network, water management districts, and the Florida DEP Aquatic Preserves. This relates to water quality improvement actions 1.2 and 1.3, assessing and reporting trends in water quality, and assisting with consistent collection of technically sound long-term water quality data. Okay, Dr. Medina.
Hi everybody, thanks for inviting me. I've spoken to some of the committee association before, but I think this might be the first time I do it in person, so it's nice to be here with you. All right, so I'm going to talk about an analysis we did kind of several years coming, looking at water quality trends and also other indicators of eutrophication, namely seagrass and macroalgae throughout the CHNEP sort of coastal area between 2000 and 2021. So this is work that we embarked on starting in 2022. I was at the University of Florida at the time. And it took several years to sort of get all the data assembled and curated and quality controlled, and then actually do the analysis. And we got the paper published in January of this year, just a few months ago. So at this point, we're 3.5 years out from the 2021, of course. And we've got some proposals in to do an update, hopefully through the end of this year and get that out next year. It should be much quicker to update than to do the initial sort of analysis I'm presenting today. But even though this analysis, goes through 2021, it's still really, the results are still really relevant to today. I mean, we're seeing a lot of the same things presently that we saw happening after Hurricane Irma and before Hurricane Ian. So just want to acknowledge my co-authors that are listed on the slide, representing several different organizations. Let's get started. So we're going to keep this pretty high level. I'll do a quick sort of geographic orientation here and describe the parameters we're looking at, and then we'll kind of get into focusing on the changes we've seen over the short term, namely 2017 through 2021, with some commentary about longer term trends going back to 2000. We looked at data from each of these 13 areas on the slide. Okay, these are areas that are considered relatively homogeneous in terms of habitat, water quality, and so on. We've got Lemon Bay in the northwest there, a piece of Myakka River estuaries, Charlotte Harbor proper being the east wall, west wall. And then down south, of course, we've got the Caloosahatchee River estuary and areas that are near that in the south, Pine Island Sound, Matlacha Pass, all the way down to Estero Bay. Within each of these 13 areas, since the year 2000 or so, folks have been going out collecting 5 samples per month at random locations within each area. So these data can be considered, the data from each area can be considered sort of representative of that area due to that randomization. I think there's something like 30 different water quality parameters, but we're going to focus on nutrients, algae, chlorophyll, in the presentation as we did in the scientific paper. And as I said, we're going to emphasize sort of the more recent history, but the paper does provide like a longer term sort of history. So on the next dozen or so slides, we're going to go through each of these areas one by one, emphasizing sort of short term, and we're going to move from north to south in general. So I'll spend a little bit of extra time on Upper Lemon Bay just because it's the first slide, just so you can get used to the sort of format here. So there's a map indicating where we're talking about. Upper Lemon Bay is highlighted there. And then you see 5 parameters in that bubble on the right. So the first 3 are things that are measured in a water sample. You have nitrogen and phosphorus, which are nutrients, and chlorophyll, which is a sort of proxy for microscopic algae that float around in the water column. So too much of any of these things can be bad. Obviously we've got nutrient pollution problems. In a lot of areas that's going to show up as elevated nitrogen. And then chlorophyll again, is representing a certain type of algae. I mean, there's many different forms of algae, but we're talking about microscopic algae that floats around in water that we measure as chlorophyll. Then we're also looking at seagrass, which unfortunately has been declining the past several years throughout most parts of the system. And then we're looking at macroalgae, which again is part of the sort of natural part of the system, but we're seeing a sort of overgrowth. And macroalgae is different from the sort of microscopic algae I described that we measure as chlorophyll, because macroalgae, you know, mistake it for a plant easily. It's large. It can be attached to the bottom. It can blanket seagrass. It can also float and drift around in the system. And too much of it can be an indication of a bad thing, symptomatic. Oh, one other thing I want to emphasize. So with the first 3 points there, nitrogen, phosphorus, and chlorophyll, you want to pay attention to both the shape of the icon and the color, right? So the shape indicates if there was a trend or not, up, down, or sort of stable with a dot during that 2017 to 2021 period, this last 5 years of the study period. And then the color indicates where we are relative to the thresholds that we selected, which are based on the estuary-specific NNCs and Florida statutes. So green is going to indicate we're below the threshold, yellow is near the threshold, red is above. Okay, so in Upper Lemon Bay, we've got nitrogen near the threshold, and it's been stable over those last 5 years, 2017 to 21. Phosphorus and chlorophyll are green, indicating that they're below the threshold. Seagrass declined, macroalgae increased. All right, moving on to Lower Lemon Bay. We see similar results. Nitrogen near the threshold, phosphorus, chlorophyll below their thresholds. The thresholds vary across areas, by the way. Seagrass declined, and macroalgae here was actually stable. Okay, then moving on toward the Charlotte Harbor proper area with the Myakka estuary. Yep. Here we see nitrogen is consistently elevated with that red dot. We see phosphorus and chlorophyll again below the threshold. Seagrass declined, macroalgae increased. You're going to kind of see this pattern throughout: elevated nitrogen in a lot of areas, phosphorus and chlorophyll below their respective thresholds, and declines in seagrass and increases in macroalgae. And by the way, you know, when we started this project, I sort of naively expected chlorophyll to be elevated because, you know, there's these nutrient problems. The fact that it's low indicates that, you know, we're seeing the nutrient problem sort of manifest in terms of macroalgae production as opposed to phytoplankton and other sort of microscopic algae production. So chlorophyll is often going to be low here, below the threshold, and we're seeing macroalgae as a sort of major symptom that's emerging here. All right, moving over to the Peace, which is of course a major, you know, watershed that feeds into the system. Within the lower, or within the estuary segment, again, elevated nitrogen between 2017 and 2021, phosphorus and chlorophyll low relative to the thresholds, declines in seagrass, increases in macroalgae. Moving down into the Charlotte Harbor proper, along the east wall, similar results: high nitrogen, declining seagrass, high macroalgae. West wall, we see elevated nitrogen, phosphorus and chlorophyll a little bit higher here near the threshold. Seagrass declining, again, macroalgae increasing. And remember, this is reflecting, you know, impacts after Hurricane Irma, which occurred in September of 17. Now moving on to Cape Hayes, which has a little more interaction with the Gulf. Nitrogen is near the threshold. Phosphorus is below the threshold. Chlorophyll is near the threshold but declining over this 5-year period. Seagrass declined, macroalgae increased. And then down to lower Charlotte Harbor. Again, there's, you know, some interaction here with the Gulf. It's further away from the rivers. So we see nitrogen near the threshold, phosphorus and chlorophyll below. Seagrass declined, macroalgae increased. All right, now I'm going to talk about some differences between north and south over the long term a little later on. We'll continue for now, just looking at the short term story here, but I just want to sort of tease that there's going to be some interesting distinctions in how we got here between the north and the south. For the Caloosahatchee River, which of course drains its own river basin, but also receives releases from Lake Okeechobee, we see elevated nitrogen, elevated but declining phosphorus over this 5-year period, chlorophyll near the threshold but declining, seagrass also declining, and macroalgae sort of stable between 2017 and 2021. And in the Caloosahatchee River estuary in particular, nitrogen and phosphorus exceeded their respective threshold values each year. When you look at the annual average concentration of both these nitrogen and phosphorus, about the entire study period, 2000 to 2021, the nitrogen and phosphorus levels on average were higher than the regulatory threshold. This isn't a regulatory assessment. Impairments are determined through a different process, but just strictly speaking in terms of where things are on average each year compared to the thresholds, all 22 years of the study, we were elevated here for nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay, now moving on to Matlacha Pass. Yeah. So of course, Matlacha Pass is sort of problematic due to its position in the system. It's between the mainland and the island. There's a lot of sort of stagnation and lack of flow just because of where it is. It's not as easy for water to get through that area. So nitrogen and phosphorus are both elevated here. Seem to be pretty good on average for chlorophyll. But again, seagrass decline, macroalgae increased. And of course, in this area, we have a lot of hypoxic events that come from this sort of stagnation of the water. Okay, Pine Island Sound. So this is sort of an exceptional case here. Nitrogen is elevated, phosphorus and chlorophyll are below the threshold. This is the only area where recently we saw an increase in seagrass. So some indication of maybe things to come. However, you have to consider that Pine Island Sound gets a lot of interaction with the Gulf. So you get cleaner water kind of coming in and flushing things out, greater water clarity that's conducive to seagrass recovery. And we did see proliferation of macroalgae at the same time. So we're not totally out of the woods yet. Then moving on to San Carlos Bay, which is just outside of the Caloosahatchee estuary. Nitrogen elevated, phosphorus near the threshold, chlorophyll below the threshold. Seagrass declined, macroalgae increased. And finally, Estero Bay. Nitrogen was elevated, but stable. Phosphorus and chlorophyll below the threshold. Seagrass declined, macroalgae was stable. All right, so this is kind of a whirlwind. We wanted to give the details here because different people in the room are probably most interested in particular areas. But this table sort of sums up all the results we just looked at in the last 13 slides. So as you look down the columns, left to right, you're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, chlorophyll, then seagrass and macroalgae. And what you can see at a glance here is that nitrogen is sort of problematic throughout the system. You see a lot of red dots there, indicating that nitrogen has been elevated in the most recent 5 years of the analysis up to 2021. For the most part, phosphorus and chlorophyll were below their respective thresholds in each area, with the exception of the Caloosahatchee and Matlacha Pass, where we saw elevated levels of phosphorus. And chlorophyll A, we're in pretty good shape, a lot of green in that column, and a lot of down arrows indicating that chlorophyll concentrations have been decreasing. So if you just looked at the water column, you might say, okay, we have too much nitrogen, but it's not translating into chlorophyll problems, algae problems, which is why it's important to look at macroalgae. We see macroalgae increases, that's on the far right column, all throughout the system, and of course this is occurring at the same time that seagrass has declined in almost all segments, with the exception of Pine Island Sound. The situation with seagrass, of course, as I understand it, even past 2021, is that we saw this big decrease after Hurricane Irma passed in 2017. And even though the sort of bleeding has stopped, it's not continuing to decrease. We're kind of at a new sort of low level, right? So recovery has yet to happen to get back to those pre-17 levels. And one important finding from this study was that even before Hurricane Irma, we saw a lot of upward trends in nitrogen for years prior to Hurricane Irma. So with the nutrient pollution, we were kind of setting up a situation where the system was more vulnerable to the adverse impacts that we saw after Hurricane Irma and also the big 2018 red tide that followed that. As I said before, nutrient enrichment, nitrogen in particular, seems to have shifted the system from production of phytoplankton that we measure as chlorophyll toward macroalgae, which is a little more difficult to measure, but fortunately we have a lot of data on that from thanks to the various aquatic preserves that go out there and collect data each year. And so, yeah, so, you know, a lot of similarities across the system in terms of nitrogen, seagrass, and macroalgae. Now, on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some differences over the sort of long term, especially between the north and the south. So in the north, we started off in the 2000s with conditions being sort of, I'm talking about nitrogen here, nitrogen levels being sort of stable. And then as we got into the early 2010s, around 2012, we saw these consistent increases in nitrogen levels. So I'm talking about Peace River, the different Charlotte Harbor proper segments like East Wall, West Wall. And that upward trend in nitrogen continued up to 2020. 2021 was an unusual year. Nitrogen concentrations on average were unusually a little bit lower. But we did see this sort of consistent uptrend. Again, that was leading up to Hurricane Irma in 2017. So we went from stable to increasing in the north. In the south, which is more predominantly driven by the Caloosahatchee, we saw completely different behavior. So for the long term, going back from 2000 to the early, maybe to mid 2010s, we saw a lot of ups and downs in nitrogen. And then after about 2014, the nitrogen levels in the water column were sort of stable, like remarkably stable. Okay, now there's still seasonal variability, but as an annual average, you see this kind of notable stability. So, we don't quite have an explanation yet for those differences between north and south. Obviously, Caloosahatchee and Peace and Maga, south and north are a bit different, just in terms of the inputs. But the fact that, in the north, you see this responsiveness to nitrogen loading with an increase in nitrogen levels throughout the water column, whereas in the south, you see this sort of stability emerge most recently. This is a sort of curious thing. And, we have some hypotheses about what might be going on there. It might have something to do with legacy nitrogen that's sort of accumulating and stored in the system and how that expresses itself over time. But that'll be an interesting sort of scientific question to look at that could have some management implications. Overall, as well, of course, this is a very large watershed, 3 major rivers that go in, and we also have Lake Okeechobee and its watershed to consider that feed through the Caloosahatchee. So, targeting solutions to this problem on the coast, the nutrient pollution problem on the coast, and seagrass recovery, it's really going to take a portfolio of solutions. I mean, there might be, some areas where the focus should be on septic to sewer conversion, and other areas where it's about updating wastewater infrastructure, and other areas where it might be about, policy or various solutions to agriculture that's further inland. You can talk about, conservation easements, land acquisition, stormwater treatment areas that sort of intercept nutrients before they make their way to the coast. But it's going to take, some granularity and some sort of granular analysis to figure out where can we, where are the hotspots, not only in terms of the amount of nutrients that they're putting out, but also in terms of their influence ultimately on the coast. And then how does that align with where we can actually do interventions in a practical or feasibility sense. And then finally, of course, it's worth considering that restoration of this area is tied into the broader sort of South Florida ecosystem, considering Everglades restoration. As efforts increase to move water south from the lake, that should help take pressure off the coast if we can get releases, harmful releases at least to be decreased through the Caloosahatchee. And yeah, I'll leave it there. So the next slide shows where you can find the paper if you have trouble finding a free copy, you can email me or Jennifer or Nicole. There's also this fact sheet the CHNEP put together that sort of summarizes the main findings of the paper. I believe that's in the packet.
Yep.
Okay.
Looks like that.
So it's a 2-pager, a lot of graphics, and kind of gives you a rundown on the main findings of the paper. And then finally, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out. My contact info is on the next slide. And I think should have plenty of time for some questions and discussion.
Yeah, it's great having this data compiled and the trends analysis. I think that's very useful for communities like ours to looking at areas that need reductions in nutrients and water quality issues. Sometimes I get a little more nervous about the lead nitrification to loss of seagrass. I mean, because there's so many variables involved. I know the Caloosahatchee is a heavily managed system, as you well know, and you talked about circulation and things of that sort. I'm almost more leaning in that watershed. The seagrass is more response to salinity changes in the over, a lot of more of a over loading versus just the concentration. In fact, if you look at a lot of the concentrations in the river, they're not extreme. They're not like wastewater type quality. They're like maybe 1 milligram per liter or less. I mean, that's kind of still on the cusp of meeting standards. So I just get a little nervous for like along the lines of like Okeechobee releases equals red tide. I think there's so many things involved to kind of peel that onion back apart to see what all the variables are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's a very fair point. It is a difficult line to draw all the way from nutrient or nitrogen loading to seagrass loss. And there are certainly a lot of different factors that go in. Salinity changes, temperatures, warming, things that are out of our control, right? I think there's also a case to be made that, in terms of the things we can control, nutrient loading being a major one, to the extent that there's more, like the threats that we can control are increasing. Hurricanes, salinity changes, temperatures. There's a case to be made to sort of be more aggressive on the things we can't control and make space for those, right? Whether or not that's effective, I mean, that's a sort of scientific question, or what the outlook is on that, what's the probability of success if the endpoint is seagrass. But there are also going to be a lot of other benefits to reducing nitrogen loads as well. So if the goal is to reduce nitrogen, and like what's the best case to make for taking that step? Maybe the clearest argument to make would be, macroalgae or red tide or something else. Because for the more steps in that process you get to, the more challenging it becomes to draw that link, even if it's truly there. But there are, several reasons I think to work on reducing nitrogen loads, even given what you said, yeah.
And I would add that one of the reasons we wanted to look at water quality together with seagrass and macroalgae is because there's a relationship between all three, where the macroalgae is actually shading and smothering seagrass. It's one factor. I mean, there's definitely, we talked in management committee about heat, and there are some signatures with the most recent SwiftMud seagrass data that shows that there are heat related losses, very small, thin margins in shallow waters where seagrass is lost. That looks like a heat related loss. But the macroalgae expansion, we see that very clearly directly in areas where we're experiencing the most seagrass loss. So we see like the physical effect of the macroalgae literally shading out and smothering seagrasses along the east wall of Charlotte Harbor and stuff like that. So we think like that's the new story, is like we used to look for chlorophyll, and obviously chlorophyll is not what's uptaking the nitrogen. It's now macroalgae, and the macroalgae, like chlorophyll can block light and inhibit seagrass growth. So it's really looking at everything together. And that's part of our big messages now, like, let's not just look at water quality samples, let's look at bioindicators as well to really understand the full scope of how all of this is connecting. And the red tide, there's been research that confirms that even red tide can kind of cycle nutrients in a way that can be harmful to seagrass. And so it's very complicated, like you mentioned, Roland, and I think we're trying to do our best to now with the new water atlas pages by bringing all the pieces together on one page to show the complexity like visually, and kind of even this graphic that we put together, trying to show, you know, you can't just assume, oh, more nitrogen, more chlorophyll, right? Like Dr. Medina mentioned at the beginning, might have been one of the logical assumptions that one would make, but now like seeing it all together, you say, oh, wow, it's no longer going to chlorophyll, but you definitely see this macroalgae ticking up significantly. So we're trying to be careful to not overstate, but we also want, like to Dr. Medina, people to understand the value of investments in nutrient reduction through wastewater upgrades, stormwater upgrades, and how that can be, you know, helping to address one of the contributing factors to the estuary water quality decline and seagrass loss that we're experiencing.
Any correlation between the, we'll call it new building density?
So yeah, that's a great question. So this study, I mean, it mostly functions as sort of documenting changes that have happened. Asking that kind of question about attribution, great question, super important, something that I'm personally really interested in. But you know, we didn't really touch that with this study. So that kind of goes to the previous comment that, you know, I mean, we're not operating in a vacuum. Like, we know enough about how these systems work to draw certain associations, or at least speculate on them pretty confidently. But we haven't quite looked at that kind of thing yet. That is something I'm actually, I would touch on in some future projects that I have some proposals for right now. So I think that's a really important question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of changes occurring very rapidly. So, you know, even the idea of a hotspot is sort of dynamic, right? I mean, there's interventions being put in, there's new developments being put in, and getting a real handle on that is something I'm personally really interested in continuing to study and in a data-driven way. I think we don't even have to rely on big, expensive, and often uncertain models to draw those kinds of inferences. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, how's it going?
All right. So just to build a little bit on this, so one of the benefits of this kind of work is showing the need to do the additional work to really dig down into those details as to where might be coming from, other causes, just kind of you know, providing that little line of proof that we need to expend some more resources looking into it. And one thing I brought Roland and would love to get with you guys in the county, maybe stand all about. So the next step that we're doing on our end, and I got to give a shout out to Sea Grant. They had the presence of mind with their Eyes on Seagrass program, the volunteer program, that for a few years, when they sent their volunteers out to look at seagrass, they also said, hey, if you see some macroalgae floating around, grab a handful of it and throw it back. And they held on to those bags of macroalgae in a freezer for a couple of years. And finally, over the last few months, all of those were run for isotope analyses and carbon nitrogen ratios that we can then use to start to kind of tease out where there might be some potential sources of nitrogen that's being assimilated into that macroalgae. And so we've got a couple of PhD kids way smarter than me at University of Florida that's parsing through all that data and putting it together, and we'll get that to you too, that we can kind of use to start kind of talking through that part of building the story. But that's kind of the next logical step in the chain. You know, and really sort of now building on that kind of effort and see how we can expand that to start to get to that more, okay, where's this coming from and what is this actually doing in terms of how is it feeding, quote unquote, the macroalgae that we're seeing, and to what extent, and so, I'm sure there's similar work being done in areas around us, so I know we'd be interested in having other groups, counties, whatever they do.
Any other questions or comments?
Is this an ongoing study? And this is to 21. We've had Ian,
Right.
a couple other hurricanes,
Yeah.
more development. more folks moving into the area. So I was wondering, is this an ongoing study?
That's the intent, yeah. I mean, this first time, sort of establishing this kind of, getting all, 20 some years of data together in the first place, and then building the workflow to do this kind of analysis at scale like this. It took some doing, a few years. But I do have a few proposals in to try to continue that work and provide an update. So, my goal is to try to publish by next year something that would cover, through the end of this year. And, I mean, I think be able to provide that in a few years. I didn't get into the methodology, but if you are interested and you read into the paper, there's quite a bit of nuance to the trends and the dynamics beyond what you'd usually see in a trend analysis that relies on a method called Mann-Kendall, where you kind of just get an up or down, uptrend or downtrend sort of answer over the entire period. Here, we're able to dissect the entire 22-year period into 5-year chunks over a sliding window. And so we can get a real nuanced view of how things have changed over time. And so there'll be a lot of value to continue updating that, especially considering what's happened those last few years. We actually, I debated sort of adding 2022 to the study once we got into 2023 and we were continuing to work on it. But we figured, ending on a big hurricane year probably would mess up the statistics a little bit, so it'd be better to leave that for an update. And so the next sort of update will be a really interesting sort of hurricane-themed, unfortunately, story, because as you said, I mean, we had Ian in 22, and then several hurricanes last year.
But I had the same question because, I mean, at EPA, we do studies and sometimes it takes us years to get the data out, but I think I'm hearing you say, we have the data. So we have all of this data for the next 4 years. It's just not, we haven't gotten to publishing a report yet. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, I mean, we haven't, it's out there to be had. We just haven't assembled it and analyzed it yet.
Got it.
But I think at this point in 2025, it's probably a safe bet that we could do an analysis through the end of 24. I think that, by the time we completed that project, we might be able to just do all the way through this year and then publish next year. But if there was urgency to get something out sooner, we could probably do an analysis through the end of last year. We can get that out more quickly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there is a bit of a data lag and the QA/QC process to make sure that we get, and then we've even had to do a little curation of the data that made it through that process to tee it up for this analysis. But we are looking forward, hopefully CHNEP and helping to fund and be involved in the next iteration of this to do the most recent 5-year period. Since we are kind of looking at it at 5-year chunks. So the article that we co-authored together with Dr. Medina and the other co-authors, there's a QR code here. So you can actually, it was published in a scientific journal, and you can access all the details of what went into developing the methodology using a GAM model to do the trend analysis and whatnot. But we're just so pleased because, it takes a lot of years of the different entities in the partnership who have collected this monitoring data to really synthesize it and understand what is it telling us? What are we learning? Because that's a step that often isn't done, is to take it all the way to over the finish line to say, okay, yeah, we've done all this work to do that. We've done impairment assessments and things like that with it. But really this kind of deeper dive analysis to really dig in on understanding what's happening in our systems was sorely needed and is something that we look forward to continuing to build upon and even put into the Water Atlas. We've talked about updating the trends analysis in the Water Atlas with this more sophisticated GAM modeling so that it could kind of help to automate some of this as well. So, it's a really big lift to do the first initial, it's always harder to build something and do it the first time than to replicate. And I really appreciate Dr. Medina, and, he was with University of Florida at the time and has since gone out on his own. And we just continue to have a strong partnership with UF and with him on these types of initiatives to look at these types of analyses that can help us pinpoint where the problems are and what we need to do management-wise to address them. And we have other ideas going forward on things we can do that expand into the upper Peace River watershed beyond the coast. So we are not, it's good to look at what's happening downstream, but now that only feeds our thinking into where we need to do deeper probes upstream to kind of understand better where the nitrogen's coming from.
Yeah, regarding the data, I want to acknowledge Brandon and Nicole. So the CHNEP monitoring program going back to early 2000s, I mean, it's just remarkable, like sampling design and remarkably consistent effort to collect all these data over the years. And, I started working in this area several years ago, found this data set and realized, oh my God, like there's this huge potential here. This is a really rich data set, but it's sort of scattered right now. It needs to be assembled. And I mean, it took a lot of really tedious, like getting on the phone sometimes with people that have been around for years and could answer questions about when they switched labs and why this data point is labeled this way. Anyway, so it took quite a bit of doing with Brandon and Nicole's help to really curate a nice data set that now is out for public use. Other researchers can use it. It's open source, and the goal is to continue sort of building on it as time moves on.
Any other questions or comments? Any folks online want to add anything or ask any questions?
Just a real quick one. I know there's a lot of interest in responses to hurricanes and interest in bringing in and Helene and Milton, but those are such extreme events. I don't know if they're indicative of how you manage a watershed, because especially for like the tidal surge ones, that's a mix of, that's not really what I'd call your normal runoff. That was a lot of just watersheds overlapping each other. There was really no rhyme or reason. I mean, it blankets the whole area. Same with Irma, huge amount of rainfall, watersheds intermingle. What managers probably more interested in what's going on a norm. I guess hopefully that's not the new normal, but a normal areas, maybe pull some of that data out and say, hey, what's really going on in a watershed in terms of our practices and things and land uses we have going on that might be more beneficial to us.
Yeah, that's a great point and an important distinction. So, right, there's managing for sort of normal conditions and managing for extremes, and those are often two different things. That's one nice thing about this form of trend analysis, is that if you see a really unusual year where you've got this big peak and it's inside of the ordinary because there was a big hurricane or a couple of hurricanes, that is sort of baked into the way the analysis is done. So that kind of greater variability will end up having less of an influence over on trends when you're looking at more long-term things.
Right.
So that's sort of a nice feature of the way that we did the analysis, is it sort of accounts for that. And so you are actually looking at things more in terms of like normal conditions. Yeah, that's a good point.
Anything else? Great. Thank you so much.